so deeply honored and excited to present three of the artists. I have to say one of them is me, that are in the exhibition Memory is a Verb, Exploring Time and Transience. Each month, three artists from the exhibition will share their projects, and I hope you can join us for all 4 evenings. In January 2021, in the midst of our second year of the pandemic, 11 photographers participated in my year-long masterclass. The idea of this class was to not only bring projects to completion, but to also elevate all parts of their photographic journey: the work, the articulation, the writing, and most importantly, the way they think about their projects. I have been so moved and inspired by this amazing group of visual thinkers, and the result of our individual and collaborative efforts is an exhibition that speaks not only to this moment in time, but to the concepts of loss, mortality, and legacy. Subjects that all of us have been considering in this time of confinement. The projects are an exploration of what inspires us and us to seek solace and re-examine our histories. Subsequently, unearthing discoveries about ourselves, our relationships, and our place in the universe. The photographers all have created projects around the idea of time and transience, approaching subjects different and unique perspectives. Through the artistic expression found in the exhibition, Memory is a Verb, Exploring Time and Transience, 12 women from different geographies, experiences, and backgrounds give voice not only to their reality, but to the multitude of perspectives and possibilities contained within. It is a universal desire to be connected and to be remembered. To honor our past into our future. The true meaning during a time of profound disruption is a humbling human journey eloquently captured in Memory is a Verb. So I want to give you a peek into our website and exhibition that you can all visit yourselves. So let me, the website is memoryisaverb.com. It lists all the artists and their projects that you can scroll through. We have separate lists of artists and what their work is. We have a tab for exhibitions because we are hoping that we have some exhibitions in brick and mortar spaces. We have the dates for our talks on the site, and our contact information. I have to give Annette LeMay Burke a huge thank you for creating this website, and Elizabeth Bailey for being an incredible graphic designer. It really helps when you have people in a class that have all these other skills and talents that can bring us all together so beautifully. After each artist talk, we're going to do questions for each person because I think it will get too confusing if there are three artists getting questions. So as we're listening to the first artist and you have questions for her, please put those in the chat and I will share them with her. On that note, it's with great pleasure that I introduce Annette LeMay Burke, who happens to be the LACP Member of the Month. Annette is a photographic artist and Northern California native who lives in the heart of Silicon Valley, a longtime observer of the evolution of the Western landscape. Burke is interested in how our environment changes over time and the artifacts, both tangible and temporal, that are left behind. She examines the progress of technology as a marker of time, how the built world and the natural world intersect, and how our memories affect perception of place. Burke received a BA in geology from the University of California at Berkeley. And after a decade-long career in high tech, she is now focused on her fine artistic practice. She's exhibited throughout the US and internationally. Her work has been published in the New York Times, LA Times, Daily Mail, Hyperallergic, Newsweek, Japan, Fraction, All About Photo, etc. And in 2017, Burke was selected for a finalist for Critical Mass. In 2021, she was awarded first place in Lynn Scratch's Vernacular Photography Exhibition and was a winner of the Imago Lisboa Photography Festival and semifinalist in the National Portrait Gallery's Outwin Buchever competition. In 2021, Daylight Books published a monograph of her disguised cell phone tower images called Foliage. And if you haven't gotten a copy of this book, do it now where there's still some available. It's really an amazing record of technology today. So welcome, Annette. So thrilled to have you here this evening.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. All right. So thank you to LACP and to Aline for bringing together this group of talented photographic artists. I'm really honored to be a part of the Memories of Verb project. My name is Annette LeMay Burke, and I'm a native of the San Francisco Bay Area. I currently live in the heart of Silicon Valley. I mention that because so much of my artwork is about the West, particularly California, and it's also about place, time, and technology. Looking back, I realize how much my childhood and past experiences have truly influenced my work. I grew up in the suburbs in a house on a hill with picture window views of the San Francisco skyline, the bridges, and the bay. My father always encouraged me to observe what was going on in the landscape, like when new buildings were going up or how far you could see on a clear day. I learned to pick out all the important landmarks around the bay. And this picture shows a very clear morning, which I'm sure is why my father took this photo. I saw more than just the beautiful landscapes of the Bay Area. As a family, we took lots of road trips throughout California and occasionally to the neighboring Western states. My parents always had a camera with them, and soon I did too, even as a child. But I didn't realize how big a role photography would play in my life until later. Because of my interest in observing the landscape, I decided to study geology at the University of California at Berkeley. While I was there, I took my first photography darkroom class. And when I received my bachelor's degree, the high-tech industry was really taking off in the South Bay. So I switched gears and went to work for a Silicon Valley chip manufacturer. After a 10-year career in tech, I had the opportunity to pursue photography more seriously and a photographic education also. Some of my early influences were California landscape photographers like Ansel Adams and Weston. But I discovered I was especially attracted to landscapes and images that showed how the built world was modifying the environment. I discovered Edward Bertinski, whose images portray nature transformed through industry. He definitely managed to make even environmental disasters look beautiful. I was intrigued by the Betcher's typologies of industrial buildings and the new topographic work of Stephen Shore, which now evokes nostalgia for me. Richard Mizrach's images, like the aftermath of the Oakland Hills fire in '91, were especially moving to me since I had watched the fire unfold from my parents' house across the bay. A non-photographic influence for me is painter Wayne Tebow, who just died last month at 101. His colorful and not quite real landscapes really appealed to me. Plus, they depicted San Francisco and the Delta, places I hung out at and could relate to. I felt these artists gave me permission to reinterpret familiar landscapes and create images that show the viewer what I want them to see, and hopefully influence how they feel too. Here are examples of some of my early work. This is Death Valley and White Sands. And I enjoyed documenting man-made structures in the environment. This one is Utah and the Salton Sea. I also photograph family and friends. This is my son, my father. a very California landscape. And I photograph while traveling too. These two are both from Cuba. I was also attracted to scenes that evoked memory to me. Eventually, I was drawn to disguised cell phone towers. At first, I thought they were amusing and quirky elements of the built world, but then I realized that technology was modifying our environment, infringing on the natural world, and creating a contrived aesthetic in our neighborhoods. I began photographing these towers whenever I found them. The costume pillars are plentiful in California and are meant to blend in with their surroundings and hide the cellular equipment, but they usually fail miserably. Instead of providing camouflage, the disguises actually unmask their true identity. They have an array of creative concealments. They often impersonate trees, such as evergreens or palms, eucalyptus, or saguaros. Some towers serve other functions, such as flagpoles or iconographic church crosses. But generally, the towers are just simulacra, a representation of reality. They are water towers that hold no water, windmills that provide no power, and trees that provide no oxygen. Yet they all provide 5 bars of service. We've entered an environmental uncanny valley where technology has modified our trees, religious icons, and neighborhood landmarks. And the results are not quite right. Excuse me. The towers are also part of surveillance culture. Big tech and the government are always listening, storing, and selling the personal data transmitted from our cell phones. The cell tower work became a major project for me. Beginning in 2016, I embarked on a series of road trips across the American West to document the variety of tower designs and to explore the question, how much of an ersatz landscape and manufactured nature are we willing to accept in exchange for quality cell service? I traveled to 9 states for the project. The project culminated in a book published by Daylight Books last year. It is titled Foliage, Disguised Cell Phone Towers of the American West. Ann Jastrab, the executive director at the Center for Photographic Art in Carmel, wrote the foreword for the book, and I contributed an essay. In the middle of creating the images for this project, my father died unexpectedly, and then my mother died the next year. They had been married for 60 years and still lived on that house on the hill. They moved in right after their wedding. My mom was only 22. So we all had so many formative memories in that house. After my parents were gone, I was left with my grief, memories of our lives together, and all their possessions. One of the items they left behind was a well-organized collection of family photographs. As I was cleaning out their house, I decided to project their photos onto the walls and surfaces of the home and rephotograph the scenes. I mainly chose photos that were taken in the house, scanned them, and then used a digital projector to display them onto the spot where they were originally taken. I titled the project Memory Building. Earlier, I talked about the view from the home, and you can see the San Francisco Bay right through the front door and out the back window in this photo. By fusing the photos from the past onto the present day walls, I unearthed 60 years of ingrained memories and captured my family's vanishing history that once permeated our mid-century suburban home. This original image was taken at a party soon after they were married, probably around 1957. My father was a contractor, and our house underwent a lot of changes by his design. He put this fence up in the 70s. The original photo was taken in the 50s. The main car in the image was their best friend's Corvette. And the Bayside wetlands in the background are now home to Oracle Software headquarters. in Redwood Shores, which is another example of technology modifying the landscape over time. This is me and my mom. I'm an only child, so the little blonde girl on all the photos you'll see is always me. Interesting story, these decorative sconces that are on the wall, they were there for my entire life. And at one point, my parents switched their orientation, and I never really realized that till I constructed this photo. My parents' house exemplified the post-war ranch homes that were built in the newly created neighborhoods across the United States. They decorated their home in the early American style, popular in the 1950s. And much of the original furniture they bought remained in the house throughout their lives and inadvertently allowed me to make this series more poignant. Here I am on the threshold of my playhouse as my father and grandfather are building it in the backyard. For me, this is representative of how we are as children on the precipice of the rest of our lives as our characters are being built. The overgrown weeds represent how easy it is for adults to neglect our playful and creative inner child over time. When I created this projected image, the neighbor had parked their car so the corner of the bumper was just visible beyond the stone wall. And that echoed the corner of my parents' car that was in the driveway of the original image. And both images also have a car going up the hill there. And when I saw the original photo after so many years, I remember how impatient I was as a child to move up from the play school scooter, sitting scooter, to a tricycle. In fact, my dad put blocks of wood on the pedals so I could reach them. And my father modified his motorcycle riding as I came into his life. I think many of us have stood in front of a fireplace for our parents' photographs. My mom and I again, she was my Girl Scout troop leader. And the garage was always packed with my father's tools and projects. It was very startling to see it empty. The original photo was made in 2009, the year the Snuggies were very popular. And my parents had a great sense of humor and posed for me for this photograph. The animatronic, motion sensing, singing, pun spewing fake stag's head on the wall attests to that too. His name is Buck. This family slideshow night was in 1960, a little before my time. And for my project, I repurposed their slide projections in the house, re-envisioning a technology that is rarely used in the 21st century. I ended up selling the home, and as it was being prepared for sale, the walls were literally whitewashed for the new owners. I documented the changing story and showed how my memories continued to resonate within the walls. This is my son and my mother. He's now 22. And while the home and my parents' stability provided a solid foundation for my upbringing, it also provided a trustworthy touchstone for them in their final years, as dementia and memory loss robbed them of so much. Constructing the projected tableaus made the memories more substantive for me, provided solace for my grieving, and created a new family pictorial legacy for my son. With so many significant experiences rooted and intertwined within this building, saying goodbye to it was also saying goodbye to my parents. This quote by contemporary photographer Hiroshi Sugimoto really resonated with me. I did feel like I was preserving my family's memories while creating this project. I spent a lot of time picking the appropriate photos to use for the projections, and seeing those old images anew often did shoot me right back in a time machine. This is the view from the house on one of the last nights I spent there. I took this photo close to 60 years after the first pano I showed that my father took. A lot has changed on the skyline. My family's collection of photographs told our history tied to one specific place, our home. And while my memory of the house spans many decades, the transience of a mere fraction of a second shutter click creates a physical image that can spawn its own specific memories, different for everyone viewing it. I have reiterated that process by projecting those images back in their original location and creating a new dialogue. The memories are no longer static, but active, like a verb. Thank you for being here tonight and allowing me to share my story.
Thank you so much, Annette. And if anyone
you.
has any questions, now is the time to put them in the chat. And I have a couple of questions for you, and if we don't get any questions. I would assume that every time you drive by a cell phone tower, you get an urge to photograph it. Is the project over, or will you continue documenting it over time?
I do still take photos of them, especially if I'm traveling. I kind of know the ones around here. They're not, I've already shot those. So yeah, if I see a good one, I will shoot it. So it's not over.
And I was thinking about, you mentioned the fact that technology has really altered our landscape. And what do you think is the future of that? I mean, how do you see in the future how technology might change our landscapes?
Well, I do have ideas about the cell phone towers. You know, as 5G is being rolled out, it's a different structure of the antennas in the towers. So there's more closer together and they're much smaller. So they can be concealed on the top of streetlight poles. I'm sure you've seen them and you may not even have noticed it, but they're kind of a fat pole at the top. So I believe that these disguised foliage towers, as I like to call them, are going to go away, like the, you know, drive-in movie theaters or phone booths, or drive-up film development places. All these technologies, which ironically are all what we use our cell phones for now too.
Yeah. Carolyn asks, how were you able to make such bright, clear photos during the day, i.e. the playhouse, with projections?
Yeah, that was a challenge. I would usually shoot just as the sun was going down, either before or after, depending on where it was. But yeah, there was a few days I had to redo them because they didn't quite cut it. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just searching for another question. I just a comment is that when I look at your newest project, the project that's in Memory as a Verb, I just think it's so wonderful that you have those photographs, because once you sell the family home, you cannot enter it anymore and the memories are gone. And you've done such a beautiful job of capturing all of that in a profound way. And as you said, it's a legacy for your son. So bravo to that. So
thank you. Yeah, it is comforting to have these created images too. It makes me feel a little more a part of it.
Yeah. And Vaughn has asked, are you going to continue working with your family photo archives to create more images?
I don't think I'll be doing the projected images. I kind of have a book dummy with the projected images and some of the items from the house. So I'm working through that. So the other photos would be included, but not projected.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Annette. That's a fantastic body of work, and your artist talk is, of course, as stellar as the work. So next up is Jennifer Pritchard. And I am thrilled to introduce her. Jennifer is a photographic artist and storyteller based in Laguna Beach, California. Her experience includes years as an innovative, creative fashion executive, leading global brands, telling rich and compelling stories to engage and excite consumers. A skilled business leader in developing results in complex situations and markets. Her passion and highly collaborative nature galvanize teams to accomplish their goals. And I'm just inserting here that Jennifer is now a board member of LACP, and we've already seen her in action with her collaborative and really interesting take on things. So thank you. So in 2015, her father's death inspired her to tell her own stories. Geographies have played an essential part in her perspective, whether the New England of her birth, the mid-Atlantic upbringing, her Southern schooling, or internationally through roles in global brand leadership. In Pritchard, understanding the places and their rich stories engendered a deep appreciation of the unique and common. A natural curiosity combined with a paradox-filled childhood inspired explorations of life, loss, memory, and dreams across a diverse photographic and literary toolbox. Pritchard was chosen as an emerging artist in 2017 by APA National. Her work has been selected in competition by notable photographers such as Arthur Meyerson, Laura Valenti, Krista Dix, Jacob and Elisa Hessler, and Sam Abel. She was chosen for the California Open at Tag Gallery in 2018 and 19, and her work is an ongoing part of the collection at the On Center Gallery in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Aline. So thank you very much for that really amazing introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone this evening and tell a bit of my story. My camera is the instrument for my curious mind to explore how I feel and think. Sometimes it's a pencil or a paintbrush to sketch or color life experiences. Sometimes it's a wrench that loosens the deep dualities within me. And sometimes we just have fun and play together. Always, it's the companion who helps me resolve life's biggest questions of time and loss through the beauty of the natural world. If someone asked me when I started my photographic path, I respond about a decade ago, but the answer may be that I was a photographer from the beginning and only realized it a decade ago. Sitting here on the lawn of my grandparents' New England farmhouse, I sit adjacent to my family, intrigued by the Brownie camera in my lap. It makes me think about nature versus nurture, how we enter this world and how we make our way. The curiosity evident in this image is still deeply ingrained within me. I found the medium of photography gave me an outlet to merge ideas and imagery in ways that expanded my connection to the world and the people in it. That was me then, and this is me now, kind of. I took this portrait in August of 2020 in the nearly empty shell of the last house where my parents lived. It was part of my first workshop with Aline Smithson through LACP and represents who I was at the end of my relationship with their home, sitting alone in the ladder back chair that visually and sonically defined over 3 decades, next to the bench that played a recurring role in my mother's struggle of resignation and release. They were found randomly adjacent to each other, unclaimed remnants of a life, the artifacts. The direct gaze I hold to the frame represents the emotional role of companion and steward of my mother's final days. It's a sobering part of the human experience and one that we all share, and produced a creative trilogy beginning in 2019 that encompasses various photographic genres, writing, and is much of the work I share with you today. My parents made their life and ours in the Brandywine River Valley, a beautiful and historical part of the country in southeastern Pennsylvania. This childhood place provided fertile ground for developing passions such as music, books, art, and the natural world. Rich with inspiration, I was profoundly moved by the Brandywine School of Artists, most notably Andrew Wyatt. His landscapes are those of my childhood. The desaturation of his tempera and watercolor was the foundation of my artistic and photographic language of color and light. During the trips back and forth to my mother's house over her illness, I reconnected to this geography I left over 40 years ago. I began to understand my unconscious connection to a landscape, its imprint. On the left is a watercolor sketch of Andrew Wyatt and an image I made in 2019. His work remains a subliminal artistic language for me. Again, his image on the left and mine on the right. This is my mother. She was remarkable in so many ways. She was a bit of a Renaissance woman who could think as well as she could do. She was wildly independent for her time, interested and interesting, and believed that I could do or be anything I wanted, ensuring I had the skills to do so. This belief was fundamental in my later choices in education and career. As she encouraged me, she encouraged herself, and at age 45 began an interior design business. It therefore makes sense in retrospect that a love of design and fashion was in my DNA. My professional life includes years of leading global brands, as Aline so nicely conveyed, telling rich and compelling stories. That life left little time for personal pursuits, and my husband was the first to recognize a lagging spirit and the need for a creative outlet. He gave me my first camera, the Olympus pen, for a combined birthday celebration trip to Paris with my mother. These first snapshots were taken with that camera in 2010. It brought me back to life, and I immediately began pursuing all things photographic, enlisting my first mentor, Peter Politis at the Dallas Center of Photography. I don't have a formal photographic education, but have found great teachers who've become mentors and friends. All have been instrumental in my photographic journey, and I cannot thank them enough for their generosity in helping me discover my voice years after shepherding others' voices. And I'm grateful for places like the LACP that provide educational opportunities and community. My mother came by her strength naturally. This is a photograph of my grandmother at age 97 having her first Cosmo, and it's part of a blog I began to celebrate her recipes. Each Wednesday night, a small group of us would congregate and cook one of her meals. This project-based learning pushed me beyond the viewfinder. My indomitable grandmother's first Cosmo hangs in a total stranger's Manhattan apartment acquired through On Center Gallery in Provincetown, Massachusetts, thus extending her reach and mine beyond our lives and my camera. And that is something I deeply appreciate. Another project had the ambition to learn portrait photography. Monthly scheduled open studio time allowed friends to come and go, have their portraits made, and to laugh. We shared fun Friday afternoons. I learned a new skill, and we got a book of memories from it. I expanded my understanding of different genres, blogs, books, and photography's back end through these projects and others. And I got priceless images. In this one, Peter took of me and my mother during one of those studio sessions. It's one I look at now, often in her absence. The lessons and skills learned through my photographic pursuits helped in life's most complex and trying tests, to be aware, present, and importantly, to make art from those deep wells of emotion we're reluctant to face. That's where the magic is. A pivotal change happened in the final days of 2018 and inspired the work that became Traces. While in a crosswalk in my hometown, I was struck by a car, the driver undoubtedly admiring the seaside views. As I healed and learned to move again, long walks through Laguna provided the quiet space to visit my internal landscapes. And I began to think, feel, and importantly, see differently. It was no longer only what was in front of the lens, but inside me coming through the lens. The accident also changed the way I thought about time, and it encouraged in-depth explorations of physics so my head could understand my heart. For the first time in my life, I found myself deep in the words of Einstein, Carlo Rovelli, and Stephen Hawking, always with a beginner's mindset, so vast is the complexity of time. As I put a name to my experience, elasticity, I acknowledged that my approach to time as a linear construct was forever changed. Instead, I was drawn to the in-between places, the tiniest slices between reality and dreams, where I was able to start unraveling the infinite in me by puzzling together the fragmented pieces of my life into a coherent narrative. Traces explores the lingering effects of time and memory on the present. Out of the misfortune, new windows opened, and with Traces, I began to think about myself and my practice from a more spiritual and emotional place. Susan Bernstein shepherded me through this transition, and I'm very grateful for her encouragement and support. My evolution affected all the subsequent work. The trauma of facing my mortality prepared me for what would happen to my family in 2019, 20, and 21. Traces is the seed that shifted my perspective intellectually and artistically. Dis-ease is a chronicle of daily FaceTime conversations with my mother as we navigated the last year of her life, coincidentally the year of the pandemic. As I mentioned earlier, it's a trilogy of work that began in 2019 and spans 3 years and ranges from the representational to the abstract. I'm still processing all that happened, but I have the pictures. While most were sheltering in place during the frantic height of the pandemic, I spent a good portion of the year traveling back and forth from California to southeastern Pennsylvania to care for her following heart surgery. Between those visits, our communication consisted of daily FaceTime conversations where I watched her image slip further down the screen towards the unknown, ending in August of 21 with a final visit together before her passing. I began documenting our daily conversations, hers relating the vagaries of her weakening body, and mine exposing the natural world beyond our confinement. The isolation, distance, and despair of 2020 were surreal, and as the year progressed, the acknowledgement that her end was near made the experience more abstract. Recursive images inside themselves, repeatedly repeated as each day transitioned to the next with little to no change, other than her getting smaller and weaker and seeming farther and farther away. My mother was stuck in a place she didn't want to be, filling a tiny screen that contained her once bigger than life personality. And I was stuck, unable to be with her due to the vicissitudes of COVID. This is how we spent our time. FaceTime was a window that encouraged us outside ourselves. As her final days approached, I came to consider it a mirror, reflecting my mortality to me. It was no longer a window shared between us, but a portal to our shared future. I am honored to be a part of the extraordinary group of women photographic artists exploring the liminal space between time and transience in Memory as a Verb. With the support and guidance of the incomparable Aline Smithson, each of us in unique ways found ourselves seeking a greater understanding of the concepts of loss, mortality, and legacy. The idea of transience, that something can change us in the briefest flap of a butterfly wing, reflects my experience and contribution to the project. The offing began as a post-2020 reset in response to the pandemic and my mother's failing health. February of 21 was the quintessential block of time, 4 perfectly structured 7-day weeks stacked one on top of another. I set out to make a typology by visiting the same cove every morning from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. with my vintage Rolleiflex camera. At the time, it seemed a change was in the offing. News of a vaccine appeared on the horizon, and with it, a return to the freedoms we'd taken for granted. The exercise was designed to build ritual into days and weeks that had become shapeless, safely connect back to the natural world, and ignite hope. For those unfamiliar, the offing is a nautical term that refers to the deep sea seen from the shore, literally meaning you would be to port by nightfall. Colloquially, it's evolved to define what's in the near or distant future. From my home, I see the one-dimensional, vast, and equanimous horizon line that stitched together my mornings and nights for over 20 years, connecting what was, what is, and what would be, or so I believed. But life for me and for so many of us had become surreal. The offing, which began as a practical exercise, became an examination of the fluidity of time and place, where we find solace. The morning ritual informed broader thinking about the elasticity of time, loss, and the things we hold constant. Time conflated from perfect weeks to yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and then further conflated to past and present as the future, what was in the offing, held only the imminence of my mother's death and an uncertain future. The images are intentionally restrained, conveying the paradox of time's complexity and its ordinariness, the fact it's so often taken for granted. Its immeasurable continuance contradicts its fleeting nature, not unlike the horizon itself, there and yet not. There's something primal about standing oceanside, every sense alive with the rhythms of the sea and possibility. Each of my 28 mornings, I smelled the marine layer, heard the waves, felt and tasted the spray, vitally awakening senses dormant in the prior year. It energized me, connected me back to the natural world. Our human experience of the sea is a universally shared one that supersedes our differences. And that ignited hope, enough so that I will again visit the sea each morning in February 2022. When the developed film was before me and the intention was complete, I marveled at how much the colors and bounty of the natural world changed each day. It's the ebb and flow of life, rolling with the tides. I found solace in that one thin line, safely in the distance, steady and unchanged, as it had been before me and will be after me. And in that, I discovered the intersection of time and timelessness. I encourage you to find a February ritual. And if you'd like to follow along, I can be found on Instagram documenting mine. Reverberations is a new project that began in late 21. It continues to explore the core themes of my work around time, nostalgia, and loss. My curious mind is now pointed towards merging audio and image data. Over the last years of our time together, I recorded my mother as she shared bits and pieces of our history. I'm pairing archival images and audio recordings with portraits I made of her artifacts. This is one of her many teacups. As I packed up the few bits I would take with me, I started considering the idea that these cups of my mother and her mother before her absorbed the sonic reverberations of every morning coffee, every afternoon tea, every evening meal within them, asking myself whether her energy was conserved within the porcelain. It's a liberal application, very liberal, of the first law of thermodynamics, that no energy gets created in the universe and none is destroyed. Swirling within the teacup and rising with the steam, she tells me of how she and my dad met. Her sigh as she remembers. The lake cabin where they spent their honeymoon, and the house he built on land my grandmother gave him. Before she drifts off to sleep, I hold the teacup in my hand and tell her, I will remember, Mom. Thank you to the LACP, to Aline Smithson, my Memory is a Verb collaborators, who can also be followed on Instagram at Memory is a Verb. All my teachers and mentors in this fantastic community. It's been my pleasure sharing my work with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Please put your questions into the chat for Jennifer. That was just so beautiful and so articulate. Your new series is really compelling, the use of objects and places, but combined with sound waves. I think it's a really exciting exploration into whole new ways of thinking about photography. So I'm just, one thing I was thinking about is that the ocean is so vast and enormous, yet you go to it and find solace in something so beyond what is intimate. And so maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, I think the thing about it being so vast is that I see my place within the universe very differently. And I understand that I'm just a small piece in a much bigger scheme of things. And that, I think, helps me connect back to the world in a very profound way.
Well, thank you so much. Everyone is just complimenting you. I'm not getting a lot of questions.
I think that's just fine.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you very much.
And spend some time on the chat because there's wonderful comments being made. So this wonderful group of 11 photographers invited me to be part of the exhibition also. And of course, I couldn't say no. So I'm going to share with you my work in the show and what led me to making it. So the promise and peril of looking backwards. It is really true what philosophy tells us, that life must be understood backwards. But with this, one forgets the second proposition, that it must be lived forwards. A proposition which, the more it is subjected to careful thought, the more it ends up concluding precisely that life at any given moment cannot really ever be fully understood, exactly because there is no single moment where time stops completely, in order for me to take the position of going backwards. I've been thinking a lot about the idea of proof and evidence, and certainly the photographic image is one of the most profound objects that we carry into the future as a form of proof that we existed. And for most of us, it starts with our baby book. In my case, this was a bit of a failure. This note was left by my mother in an almost empty baby book. There were no photos, only a comment that, quote, "She eats anything and seems to enjoy it." But this is proof enough that I was loved. So this is where it started for me, the search for proof, the lost years of childhood, the family dinners and picnics in the mountains. What was I wearing? Did I look happy? And here's proof that I did enjoy eating. The family photo album was my connector to the past, and as a lifelong visual detective, a way to reconsider who I was and who I am now. These are photographs that are rooted in my psyche. As I grew up, I began my own collection of images as a teenager. Photographing camp friends who I no longer remember, school friends and best friends, and Victor in the top right corner was someone I lusted after for years and years with no response. This time I'm in charge of the camera. As I comb through my wedding album, my children's baby books, my own family albums, I know these objects will be carried into the future by my children. I really understand the importance of visual family histories. I want my grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know who I was. The former editor of Life magazine, David Shapiro, writes that neuroscientist and author David Eagleman has written that we all die 3 deaths. The first when the body ceases to function, the second when the body is consigned to the grave. The third is that moment, sometime in the future, when your name is spoken for the last time. And I would say there's a fourth. The moment the last remaining picture of you is seen for the final time. People I Don't Know was the first concrete series where I began considering the legacy of photographs. I wanted to create a series where the person in the portrait had another chance to be seen. In order to infuse life into these images, I asked people of the same gender and approximately the same age to hold the photograph, leaving room for the viewer to connect the living to those who had passed on. Over the years, I've collected hundreds of found photographs. Photos found on the streets of New York and Los Angeles, photos found in dusty bins at flea markets and estate sales, and photographs collected on eBay. I have a hunger to keep these photographs alive, and I felt a profound sadness that these artifacts were no longer in possession of or cherished by their families. At a certain point in your life, you begin to look backwards, to think about loss, memory, and transience, and certainly about time. When we cleaned out the large New York apartment of my in-laws, I began that march into the past, looking for ghosts and ways to remember. It was also at a time when I began observing my children with the idea of not looking backwards, but looking at the future, so vastly different from my own, a future where life was lived through a screen. In looking forward, I needed to acknowledge the past and document it before it was gone. I began to notice that my children were losing touch with the activities that previous generations had enjoyed. Tactile activities like reading a good book in a comfortable chair, playing board games on a rainy day, flipping through Life magazines, or sprawling out on the living room rug while listening to records and reading the backs of album covers. Today, we live in a world of technical distractions, and those distractions have become addictive. I see my children gathered around their computers as though it's a summer campfire, faces aglow as they peer into a world of friends and fantasy, participating in new forms of entertainment that further remove them from the childhood that I experienced. And it's because of this that I began looking at bookshelves and untouched childhood pursuits with a new eye. With great sadness, I realized that these objects will be someday obsolete, at least in their current incarnations. And like a curator of antiquities, I see them now as beautiful objects to be admired and preserved, if only on film. I can only hope for rain, a heavy rain, and maybe a power outage. With the loss of my parents and my in-laws, I began to understand this movement of possessions into new incarnations, beloved objects that find new homes and new lives. I was also painfully aware of events like Hurricane Katrina and the California fires, where photographic legacies were lost to flooding and fire. And yet these images still retain a particular beauty in their transience. I also began to look at artists such as Matthew Brandt, who was making work where the process became part of the subject matter. This is a quote from an exhibition of Brandt's. Using his surrounding as an additive medium, Brandt's printed photographs are bathed in a mixture of water collected from the site in which the composition was derived. Through this experimental process, the artist becomes closer to his specific subjects and gains a better understanding of his surroundings as a whole. Fugue State is the project that I am showing in the Memory is Not a Verb exhibition. It is a continuation of considering the future of physical photographs. Fugue state, which means an in-between state, speaks to the potential loss of the tangible photograph in future generations. Again, I look to my children to realize that they are part of the most documented generation in history, creating thousands of images for their social media outlets. But I'm painfully aware that they've never made a photographic print and will most likely have no physical photographs to pass down to their grandchildren. This loss of the photograph as object, as something tangible to be circulated through the decades, reflects the fading away of specific memories and identities, and the loss of cultural and familial histories in forms that we associate with family preservation. The photographs created for this series sit in an in-between space of the future and the past, demonstrating the clash between images and materiality. For this project, after creating analog portraits of people in my life, I have damaged the emulsion of my negatives, wounding the film stock with a variety of chemicals. I then reinterpret the image in the digital darkroom in the original negative state where the potential for both restoration and erasure are present. I am in fact damaging my own photographic legacy as a way to call attention to this shift from the physical to the visual. As an analog photographer, I have watched my practice diminished and altered by the loss of materials and methodologies. Over the years, I have collected hundreds of portraits, some acquired are almost a century old, and it's made me consider the formal portrait in the midst of the shifting sands of photography, the loss of the photograph as object, and most importantly, the loss of photographic legacies. I continue to consider photographic legacy with my newest series, Fugue State Revisited, this time with a focus on the lifespan of digital files. After the loss of a hard drive that held 20 years of analog scans, I received only half of the files back in recovery. The rest of the files were corrupted, each totally unique in how the machine damaged and reinterpreted the pixels. This alarming result made me begin to consider the ever-shifting digital platforms and file formats. And I realized that much of the data that we produce today could eventually fall into the black hole of inaccessibility, as we have certainly seen in the music industry. So what I'm showing you here is one of the corrected scans. Every single scan was a completely different visual language that the machine had created. Rather than let the machine have the last word, I have cyanotyped over my damaged digital scans. I use silhouettes of portraits from my archives as a way to conceal and reveal the corruption. By using historical processes to create a physical object, I guarantee that this image will not be lost in the current clash between the digital file and the materiality of a photograph. The Getty Research Institute stated, while you are still able to view family photographs printed over 100 years ago, a CD with digital files on it from only 10 years ago might be unreadable because of rapid changes to software and the devices we use to access digital content. Fugue State Revisited calls attention to the fact that today's digital files may not retain their original state or even exist in the next century. As we are reliant on technology to keep our images intact for future generations, it begs the question, who will maintain our hard drives after we're gone? Will we be able to conserve photographs that speak to family histories? These are important considerations for our visual futures, as we may be leaving behind photographs that will be reimagined by machines. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone taking the time out of their busy schedules and coming tonight and being part of this evening. So if you have any questions for me or the other artists, throw them in the chat, and otherwise we will go find some vodka and relax. Wow, lots of nice compliments.
Really nice compliments.
So I just want you to think about your digital files and that they may not last for more than 5 years. And what happens when your hard drive crashes? I mean, this is something I think no one's talking about it, but I think it's a really important thing to begin to consider, and how you take digital files into the future. So anyway, thank you all so much. I hope, Jason, you can keep the chat for the artists to read, and take a look at your family photo albums with a whole new light, and make sure they're protected and cared for. And you know, like all of us, when you are running out of the house, if there's a fire, you're going to grab those first. So we need photographs to take to the next generation. All right, guys, thank you. And come back next month with more fantastic talks.